Well, this is the first of a series I have interviews with various notable people about a pressing subject that's becoming more pressing every day, and that's the idea of a border poll. My guest today is the first one, and it's Kevin Meagher, a well-known author, a commentator, journalist, and a man, I suppose you might say, is a polymath, if you think about it. Uh, you're welcome, Kevin. Thank you for giving yourself your time. Um,
Delighted to.
I'll try to keep this as succinct as possible, and if you could keep your answers maybe as succinct as possible too.
Sure, no
Let's
problem.
start with the most obvious question. Do you think a border poll is a desirable outcome or a desirable event?
Yes, I do. I think it's the logical event as well. If we're going to reunify the island of Ireland, there's got to be a mechanism to do it. There can be a transfer of sovereignty between two states, obviously, but there's obviously at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement and at the heart of any common sense settlement is the issue of consent. There's got to be some level of consent. There's got to be some buy-in, and the way that we've arrived at that point in the Good Friday Agreement is that there will be a border poll if it looks likely that people will want to change the constitutional situation, and then there's a referendum, and it's a simple majority vote at that point in the north, and with a parallel referendum taking place in the south, where that question is a lot more straightforward, perhaps, than it is in the north.
Mhm.
And if there is a yes and a yes to change in the constitutional settlement, there'll be a united Ireland, and
Okay.
I think that's
Uh,
pretty much it.
some people talk about it, I don't know if you just said it, but some people talk about it as inevitable. Do you believe it is inevitable that it's just going to come, whether people want it or not, or whether people work for it or not?
I think it's. I mean, I liken it to it's like a piece of driftwood in the surf. It just keeps lapping ever closer forwards, and then it pulls out a little bit again. And the next time it comes in a little bit further, then it pulls out again, and then it goes in a little bit further, and eventually it lands on the beach because the forces pushing it along are elemental. There's an inexorable journey, and I think that's very much the case with Irish unity. We have the mechanism in the Good Friday Agreement to bring it about. That's there. It's not a political fudge. It's primary legislation. It's an international treaty. It's not something. It's not a trifle that can be put to one side by a British government or an Irish government for that matter. It's something that is there, and there are lots of actors in this debate in this issue that can keep edging it along and pushing it along. So yes, that's why I think it's inevitable.
Well, who do you think should be doing what at this stage? You talk about pushing it along. What would you say should be happening now, or next week, or next month, or next year?
I mean, campaigners should be doing their thing. There's lots of activity that's way beyond the political parties. I think there's a temptation to think that it's basically just Sinn Féin and Sinn Féin themselves alone, but it isn't. I mean, there's lots of people that have nothing to do with Sinn Féin. There's lots of people that are involved in this that have not been involved in party politics in the north or in the south. I think the SDLP could be doing a lot more. I don't think they are pulling their weight. I don't think they've been pulling their weight for a very long time. I think they're lost in terms of what their purpose is, and I think this would give them a real sense of purpose to say that whether we talk about an agreed Ireland, a new Ireland, a united Ireland, it doesn't really matter. We're talking about a new 32 county sovereign
Yeah.
island of Ireland. And I don't think they're doing enough. I think Sinn Féin sometimes rest on their laurels, I have to say. I don't see much kind of intellectual activity, if I can put it like that. I don't see books and pamphlets and reports talking about mechanisms and what a united Ireland would be like. And I think that's a big gap because that then falls back on campaigners to say, okay, then tell us what this united Ireland will be like, which is an
Mm.
absolutely fair question. Whether
Okay.
that comes from unionists or unaligned people,
Hmm.
tell us what it's going to be like then. And I think that's an
Well,
absolutely fair question. And
uh,
there's not enough activity either by, as I say, SDLP or Sinn Féin in that space to
okay.
flesh out what it will be like.
You've mentioned the fact that it's not just simply political parties that have this responsibility. Is there anything that ordinary people could do? People who might have a sort of a traditional desire for a united Ireland or a vague feeling it would be a good idea. Is there any
Mm.
way that they would play a part, or do they just simply sit there and give their goodwill through the ether?
I think that's a very good point because there's when we get into the guts of this about how you unify the island of Ireland, in a sense, the mechanism, as I say, is there with the Good Friday Agreement, and that kind of plays itself out, I think, over a period of time. But what will this island be like? And there's lots of people with lots of expertise, whether people have worked in education or health or business, or from the trade unions, or from civil society, or whatever, or from agriculture, whatever your background is. There's a great opportunity here to fill in that gap of what will this thing be like. And I think that's where the conversation over the next few years increasingly goes to not just from the concept, but proof of concept, as you would say, perhaps in engineering terms. Prove that this thing works. Tell us what it will be like. And there's lots of people with far greater expertise than I've got in terms of what life is like and what life can be like and how it can be improved. And I think that, for me now, is the really interesting part of this conversation, because it does involve lots and lots of people
Mm.
from beyond politics, that have got a stake in the future.
Yeah, how would they make their voices heard, though? I wonder what exactly. Supposing I'm someone who you've just described, who would have good feelings about United Ireland, would like to see a border poll occur at the earliest possibility, uh, but simply doesn't know what they're supposed to do or can do.
I mean, I think there's been some great work done by, I mean, particularly Ireland's Future, which I think is a very sensible approach to say, let's just throw the net as wide as possible and pull people towards the issue. And I think they've done a lot of good work in the last few years in doing that. And I think there's a lot more still to do. And I'm struck by when I see their events and the kind of breadth of people. They've got an event, I think, with trade unionists, coming up, I think, fairly shortly. And I think that's great as well, because there's been lots and lots of voices that traditionally perhaps would not have been heard, around this debate. And that I think is a really good approach, because it sort of it's a much more democratic way of approaching things. It's not about political elites, whether that's Belfast, Dublin, or Westminster. It's about people who live on the island of Ireland saying, this is how this place, we could reimagine it and make it a lot better than it is. And I think that's been a really great avenue. I mean, there's lots of people doing podcasts. There's lots of people writing. There's lots of people commentating on all of this as well. And it's a very kind of febrile and energetic and very positive space to be in at the moment. And there's plenty room for more people to come into that space.
With regard to when the border poll might take place, we know that in the Good Friday Agreement, that's in the hands of the British Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Um, when do you think he will come round, or she will come round to the point where they will say yes? Because when they say yes, they're essentially saying also, and I think that the Nationalists will win this.
That very, very true. I mean, I think the mechanism, the writing in the Good Friday Agreement about the Secretary of State sort of waking up one day, sort of sniffing the air and saying, we're going to have a border poll in a month's time, it's a bit of subterfuge, because it's about putting a filter in the way of a British Prime Minister having to make that decision, because ultimately that's what would happen. It's not a middle ranking
Mm.
cabinet minister that's going to make this decision, having worked for a Northern Ireland secretary. No disrespect to any of them, the 25 of them, but they would not be calling a border poll. It's a decision of the British government weighing up the situation in the north and in the south. And I think it's a tripartite situation. And I think it starts with electoral results in the north. The opinion polls are kind of disputed, I think is a fair way of describing it. There are some that I would put my money on. There are others I think are just absolutely barking mad. And I think electoral results are the way that we adduce whether or not there is demand to test, because of course what we're doing with the border poll is testing the constitutional proposition. That's all. So you start to look towards 2026, 2028, and 2029 for me. So this next 5 years are absolutely fundamental.
Uh-huh.
In 2026, we see elections to the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly, where it's very likely, off all opinion polling evidence and support for Scottish independence, that pro-independence campaigners will have a majority of the seats in Holyrood at that point. Now, I'll come back to that in a second, because I think that's really important. 2028 elections to the Assembly. 2029 local elections across Northern Ireland as well. These are litmus tests, I think, of whether we should have a border poll or not. We saw in the last local elections, for the first time, a majority of all the votes cast going to parties that were broadly pro-United Ireland, which was a real inflection point, which I don't think there's been enough attention paid to. I think if that were to happen in 2028 and 2029 assembly local elections, then I think there is a perfectly legitimate demand at that point to say we should have a border poll. Now, 2029 gives us another Irish election. It gives us another British election. So that's another key test. And I think at that point, the British government that comes into power in 2029, and I would imagine that's probably Keir Starmer with probably a significantly reduced majority, but probably back in office again, with two constitutional fires burning, one in Scotland, one in Northern Ireland, and it becomes, I think, very difficult for the British government to kind of keep kicking the can down the road at that point.
Yeah, but Kevin, it's not simply you're mentioning Scotland, and I take the point, and there's a whole separate interview really there. But it's the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland. Would you say that it would be necessary that Sinn Féin would be shown to be the majority party in the south, as they are in the north at present? Would that be a strong pressure on the British Secretary of State to call a poll?
It would. Going back to the point about the tripartite part of this. So some of it is what's going on in the north. Then we have a look at what's going on in the south. And we need a government in Dublin that's committed to pursuing the agenda and embracing it fully. That doesn't, as I say, want to keep kicking the can down the road. That actually wants to grapple with the issue. And then
Do you think that would have to be Sinn Féin?
No, I don't think it would be. I don't think. I try not to see this issue in party political terms. I mean, clearly Sinn Féin set the agenda and are passionately committed to this, and anchor the issue in Irish politics, north and south. But I could see a scenario where if the facts are irrefutable that there should be a border poll, that it's a Conservative government in Westminster that facilitates it, and it's a Fine Gael led government in the south that also does that. So I think that's one of the big strengths of this issue, that it doesn't rest on one or two parties or people. It is now in the bloodstream, both in Dublin and in Belfast, and increasingly in Westminster too. But the British will make the Irish do the heavy lifting. No change there. So there's got to be demonstrable demand for a border poll in the north through election results. So there's got to be, as I say, it's a bit like the sort of in the argot of eBay, that the buyer collects. That Dublin's got to be willing to kind of play ball here. Once that's clear, and I don't think we're that far off that point actually, Westminster will look and sort of say, great, well we can do business then, because if Ireland wants it, and that it's clear that this constitutional question needs to be tested, then we'll facilitate it. And I think I can hear the arguments being rehearsed by various ministers over the last few years about, it's our obligation under the Good Friday Agreement, primary legislation, we have to facilitate that border poll, or we run the risk of somebody challenging it in the High Court and having to have one anyway. So it's better that we grab hold of it. And if it looks like it's teed up in Dublin and in Belfast, then we'll facilitate it. And all we're doing is facilitating the calling of a referendum. We can sort of hands off about what we think about that, but that's all we're doing, and we leave it then to the Irish to decide.
Okay, well, we can see how, if in the north, as at present, there is a Sinn Féin First Minister, that there would be a will there you could argue that there's a will there for United Ireland in the north. If you had a Fianna Fáil government in the south, or any other party than Sinn Féin in power, can you really see Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael calling for a border poll and disrupting the state of things that have obtained since a century ago? They'd be unlikely to welcome that kind of thing, I would have thought, no?
There's definitely part of the kind of Irish temperament that kind of likes it's like the prayer to Saint Augustine, Lord make me chaste but not yet. And there's a little bit of that with I think with the Southern Irish, which is they like the idea that the kind of emotional pull is perhaps there, but sure, it's not quite the right time to do it yet. And I think part of the challenge for campaigners is to make sure that this issue is bedded in really, really deeply. I mean, Fianna Fáil, the Republican Party has, not done very much. I think it's fair to say in the last generation to try and advance any of these issues, and doesn't look like it's going to do in the immediate short term. Certainly under Micheál Martin. I mean, he spins off in the next 2 or 3 years, and then perhaps something changes there again. And I think it's about being able to the circuitry is there. It's about making sure that we can pass electricity through it, through
Hmm.
this circuit board, and I think that's the crucial thing. It's got to seem real.
Yeah,
It's
but
got to seem
how,
workable.
how do we do that? How do we send the electricity through that?
Yeah, I mean, it's setting the pace now. As I say, there's a lot of activity going on in the north. I mean, unionists will. Suppose it wouldn't be unionists if they did necessarily join in, but there's lots of people in the civic society space and the kind of slightly unaligned that are looking towards this issue and saying, actually, there's things I either need to understand or feed into this process. In the south, they're slightly behind the curve on some of this, and I think that there's a lot more activity that needs to take place in the south to say not only is Irish unity unfinished business for this place, and it will always be unfinished business for Southern Ireland. But actually, there's an opportunity to peaceful transfer of sovereignty in the next few years through consent. The mechanisms are already there. We need to prove that proof of concept that this thing is not going to, it's not going to cost you a fortune. There's been one or two completely sort of erroneous reports about the costs of unification. It's absolute nonsense. But it does expose the gap that's there at the moment that needs to be plugged, which is about proof of concept. What will this thing be like? And just as people in the north need to be engaged and need to be convinced, so people in the south need to be engaged and convinced as well. There's not enough of that going on at the moment.
Apart from things like organizations like Ireland's Future, do you see any other mechanism? Would you be in favor, for example, of a citizens' assembly?
There's different views on this. I know it's been kind of Sinn Féin's default position that if they were to enter government, establish a citizens' assembly, go away, cogitate, come up with a report, and then kind of off we go. Yes, I mean that's a nice open, engaging, transparent way of taking some of these issues forwards. But it's not about, I think, parking this in a silo and sort of saying we just need to do that and it ticks a box and then off we go. It's a much bigger conversation that needs to take place in depth and at greater pace than it does at the moment. So we've got the concept of it there. We have the mechanism to bring it about there. We've got some ideas about what it would be like if we were to have it. But that, as I say, that space is still, for me, underdeveloped. It needs lots more voices in there. It needs, I want to hear what everything from kind of Dublin high finance thinks about this, right the way through to kind of rural communities and agricultural communities and small businesses. I want to know what they think about all of this, and I
Mm.
want to know how we kind of galvanize people behind a really strong central proposition, because I think that's what's needed. The concept is evergreen and is golden and all of that. However, I could imagine it in a campaign that if you don't have a pretty worked out pitch, a manifesto, a prospectus for what this thing is like, that there will be people that will walk all the way up to the polling station with a view to voting yes for unity and then not vote for it because they're
Yeah.
not quite sure about questions about healthcare,
Yeah.
education, business, and so all these things need to be nailed down.
Okay.
There's time to do that, but this next 4 or 5 years needs to be a time now where there is much greater, as I say, pace and depth to the
Uh,
conversation about what the thing will be like.
okay. Well, in say you had a citizens' assembly, or say you had Ireland's Future coming up with a model for what steps we would take, culminating, I suppose, in a border poll. But would you see this as the border poll as saying yes to a united Ireland with a capital in Dublin with the Dáil as the parliament? Or would you see it as kind of a federal arrangement where still would be a role for Stormont? Or would you see it, for that matter, as federal in the sense of, various centres, Cork, Galway, perhaps as well?
I mean, I tend to take the view you can't have two parliaments on an island with a population of fewer than 8 million people. I think that would be perverse. And I think if we were to retain Stormont as a legislating and decision making body, then it would lock confusion in. I think from the very start. And I think we've had enough of that. So I think Stormont goes in any settlement. I think Ireland needs to. The whole of Ireland needs to reimagine in terms of centres of power. I think that's a much more interesting conversation because that includes Belfast and Cork and Galway. It includes all these places that are already a bit miffed that too much power, too much finance, too much money, too many people are clustered around Greater Dublin. It's the same issue in Britain. Now, the British model for addressing some of this, which is not perfect, which in the last sort of 10 years has been devolution through to kind of metro mayors in our great conurbations. I mean, there's something there that would I think be interesting to see how an Irish version of that might play out.
Well,
I think
you
that's something
wouldn't.
that we could develop very quickly.
Yeah, well, are you saying then that one of the places might be Belfast? Because if you had it for Galway and Cork and you didn't have one for Belfast, I guess it'd be pretty miffed.
They would be, and all the kind of all the conurbations around Ireland, because in a sense, the issues that perhaps Belfast or Derry would face would be the same ones that Cork and Waterford and Galway
Mm,
already face.
mm, mm,
So in a sense, there's a nice opportunity to look afresh to say, we've got a capital city, a very vibrant capital city. We've got a national parliament based there. However, we need to have meaningful devolution in all these places because they've been slightly left behind
yeah.
either left behind in Northern Ireland settlement. In Derry people from Derry would certainly say that, or in Southern Ireland settlement, and people from the West would definitely say that.
Mm,
So
mm,
I think there's a nice opportunity to create something that is meaningful on a 32 county basis that's symmetrical,
mm,
rather than say as we do, oh, let's keep Stormont because that would keep Unionists happy. It wouldn't be
mm,
meaningful. What
mm,
would be meaningful is to say to communities in unionist heartland areas in the northeast of this new country will give you really meaningful devolution. We'll give you much stronger local government. We'll give you a metro bear for your conurbation. We'll give you the means to actually govern and make improvements to your place in the way that this very patrician Northern Ireland settlement has never done that.
uh,
It's been controlled by a kind of political elite in Belfast and then a Secretary of State. We'll give you meaningful control of yours. I think that's a reasonable offer and reasonable
uh.
deal, particularly to more rural communities.
But you would still see the sovereign parliament as being in the Dáil in Dublin, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we need to be straightforward on that point.
Mm,
There's all kinds of ideas that over many years about the four provinces and parliaments and
Aaron,
all.
yeah.
I think exactly. I think we just need to be straightforward. That sort of says the actions in the Dole. Whatever we're calling unionists at that point, people from the northeast coming to the door to represent their constituents will be a formidable electoral bloc. So there's,
Mm,
the idea that the unionists will be marginalised is not does not bear out because of the kind of STV system that Ireland operates anyway.
mm,
There will be a very significant political bloc. Plus, you get meaningful devolution back at the ranch as well. And I think that is a sensible way forward of addressing the issue of institutions. And for me, Jude, this is one of the key things that we need to nail down, which is, we need to look at the political institutions of this new united, new Ireland, whatever we're calling it, the institutions, public services, how we develop an all Ireland economy, and also key infrastructure as well, because again, there's things there that you know Derry is a formidably difficult place to get to. Whenever I come over
mm,
to do something, it is it's
mm,
ridiculous. We've got Donegal, the situation there. We've got the fact that the rest of the country has got increasingly great road network, but the rail system is absolutely rubbish.
mm,
And there's lots of things there we can look at in terms of a proposition that says this is the infrastructure of this new island. These are the public services that you'll have in this
mm.
new island. Here's how the economy will work in this new island, and here are the political institutions that we'll have governing this new island. I think if we can nail those four themes
Yeah.
with great detail, I think you've got a really good proposition.
Okay. There's talk about, well, a great deal of talk about the notion of unionists being able to preserve their British identity in a United Ireland or a New Ireland. That isn't a contradiction in terms, is it?
I mean, there's a temptation to kind of say, how can we be nice and cuddly to unionists. And I think the danger is that you start to sort of sell them a pig in a poke. And I think clarity and honesty about all this is really important to say there will be a transfer of sovereignty. There will be a 32 county united Republic of Ireland. We're not going to drift any further away into the Atlantic from Britain. What can we do in terms of meaningful a meaningful inheritance in terms of British identity for unions, in terms of what's important. No, I don't want to write into that space and say this is what's important to unions. I don't know. I mean, if you sort of say, for example, people say, oh well, preserve orange marches. You get a lot of liberal unionists says, I've got no interest in orange marches.
Mm.
It's quite patronising to sort of offer them that.
Mm.
There are things that the dual nationality that people in the north have on the other side of the equation right now. The Irish passport holders in record numbers of people living in the north. There's probably going on for a third of the population
Mm.
of
Mm.
Northern Ireland that have a passport for the neighbouring state, which is quite a thought. Now that might flip around the other way, and it might be that the people from a unionist heritage in this new united Ireland also keep a British passport. Fine, I don't think anyone's got a problem with that at all. There may be other inducements, there may be other legacy arrangements that can be made, but I think it's up to unionists to articulate what those might be, rather than for United Islanders to kind of paste onto it. This is what we think is important to you, because as I say, very quickly you end up in a space of orange marches,
Yeah.
and you get the obvious riposte. I'm not interested in orange marches.
Yeah. Yeah. We're coming to the end now, so I just want to ask you this notion that Brendan O'Leary, this phrase that Professor Brendan O'Leary has come up with, the idea of losers' consent.
Yeah.
Now, that's something that I think worries a lot of people. Certainly in the South, they would see, blood flowing in the streets, maybe if a border poll were successful. And Brendan O'Leary, I think, is trying to address that question. What's your own thinking about the notion of loser? I'm going to say lovers' consent, losers' consent. Is losers' consent not losers' veto?
Well, that would be my concern, that you start to use the language that says that having lost a perfectly constituted democratic vote, that there is a reason not to accept the result, and there can't be. We can't tolerate that, I think, in any democratic situation, especially not. And this is when we cast an eye back on the kind of jaundiced history of the last 100 years, that one of the common themes has been what I refer to as UTOV, which is the unionist threat of violence, which has been there ever since the 1911, 1912.
Is that a well-founded fear? Is it, in other words, do you see even a small group who would resort to arms?
No, I think without agency, without support, without direction, without weapons, without a kind of a benign acceptance, I think it's very difficult for anybody to mount any significant challenge to a democratic result. I mean, in a sense, again, who are in this scenario, who are loyalists angry at? Are they angry at nationalist voters that have always been pretty straightforward? They wanted a united Ireland. Are they angry at people in the middle ground who may have come from a Protestant unionist background, but gone to university in a sort of middle class liberals who don't want to bang drums outside Catholic churches? They might have voted for it and been persuaded to do it as well. Westminster would have granted this referendum. Who are they angry at? If you are on the wrong side of as I say, a perfectly properly constituted electoral process, I'm afraid that's it. And people who resort to violence at that point are fascists and criminals, and we can't tolerate that, and we shouldn't tolerate that.
Okay.
But that should not be used as a kind of reserve argument that puts people off engaging in this. Well, we can't have a referendum on this because some of them might kick off. We can't have that in a democracy, because if we reach a point where, as I say, it's absolutely crystal clear that we should have a border poll, and if the result is, again, the border poll result is in, at that point you've got to honour it. and you've got to get behind it, and that includes Britain, and that includes unionist political leaders as well. Which
Mhm.
is why, when we see the kind of continued existence of some of the loyalist paramilitaries, we shouldn't be putting up with this at all. The PSNI, the British government particularly, should be making sure this is properly decommissioned. This is properly out of the equation altogether. Because, as I say, we can't have this lingering unionist threat of violence about we don't like it, so we'll resort to arms if we get there. I don't believe in the final analysis that we would see any
Oh,
significant problem at all. I think most unionist people would accept, and even when you listen to figures like people like Billy Hutchinson, who wrote in his book there a couple of years ago, if you're on the wrong side of this vote, you've got to accept it. So
mhm.
so who is left in this scenario causing death and murder and mayhem? I think it's a very small number of people that really don't accept this result, and there are people who don't accept any electoral results.
Mhm.
Sometimes you don't listen to them, you don't indulge them,
Mhm.
and as I say, without any agency, without the kind of without the kind of British state or the secret state sitting in the background and all the rest of it, I think it's very difficult for any of this to get any traction. So I think my view with these things is don't meet trouble halfway.
Okay.
Keep to the principles of it's a democratic vote, and it's reasonable to expect all Democrats to accept a democratic vote.
Okay, we're getting about 3 minutes left, but two quick questions. You laid out, you've talked about 26 and 28 and 29. Do you see a border poll happening by the end of this decade, as Sinn Féin says?
I think it'll roll forward a little bit into the 2030s, early 2030s. I think I
Yeah.
think I think the key election in 2029 is going to tell us an awful lot, both about Westminster and about Dublin, and of course we will have seen the results in the north at that point as well.
Yeah. Um, um, yeah. That's really all that I have to ask you, Kevin. Are there other elements about this whole topic that you'd like to highlight that I have missed?
I think we've covered quite a lot of ground there, and I think, as I say, for me, the interesting thing and the important thing now is proof of concept. That it's now in, it's United Islanders have got to go out there and talk in greater detail about what this thing will be like, because there's lots of people, fair-minded people, that are sort of saying, yeah, but what would it be like? And that question now needs to be answered in some detail, and it's up to the political parties, north and south, to get the finger out, and also everybody else with some expertise to bring to the table to pipe up as well.
Here's my last question then. Do you see it as being won? That is to
Yes,
say, you know,
definitely, definitely.
so the British Secretary of State will be right when he calls the poll, she calls it.
It will, and there will be quiet rejoicing in Whitehall and Westminster, when there is that border poll says yes, there should be United Ireland, and British public opinion will just shrug its shoulders and say we're not even sure what that means.
Right. Thank you very much, Kevin. You've been absolutely fascinating in some of the things you've said. And um, good luck with the work you're doing. You've done considerable work so far and hasten the day.
All the
Thank you.
best.